Greetings and welcome to Ghost Stories of Washington, Chapter 8, Phantoms with a Mission, Part 2, Revenge of the Wraith, and Wild Ghost Chase. They called him Oldie Neal. Ironic, really, when you consider that the poor fellow didn't even live to see his 19th birthday. Oldie might not have spent many years walking this earth as a mortal, but he certainly stayed around long enough as a ghost to make a number of people rue the day that they ever laid eyes on him. Despite his youth, Oldie was married and the father of two. He was also a homesteader who had it spread south of Spokane near Rockford, tied up against the Utah Panhandle. His future looked promising. Oldie had planted a good field of wheat, and he had chickens and pigs, too. Those who knew him admired him for both his drive and his honesty. Oldie had been the victim of a few crimes, but had never committed one himself. Unfortunately, angry vigilantes, the Gentry twins, Wes Smithley, Bert Northrup, Fritz Thorpe, Abe Murfin, and Nate Collier did not have all of these facts when they rode up on Oldie's house on a warm spring evening in 1882. All they had was a bunch of misinformation that they had taken away from the drunken ramblings of the town's ne'er-do-well, Sam Tate, earlier in the day. Tate, who had been 3 sheets to the wind as usual, had implied that Oldie Neal was responsible for the recent outbreak of horse thieving and cattle rustling that the town had suffered. Mob mentality always requires a scapegoat, and Tate's inebriated nonsense provided a name. But if any of those self-appointed lawmen had bothered with even minimal formality, such as pausing long enough to question Oldie Neal for a few moments, they would no doubt have discovered his innocence. Unfortunately, fairness and justice are never high priorities for a posse. Not long after they had first ridden onto his property, the 7 fatally misguided men succeeded in hanging Oldie Neal from a convenient tree. Their evil deed done, the vigilantes rode back to town. To a man, they all needed some good strong shots of whiskey. They hanged other men, but never before had they been cursed as they committed their crime. None of them could shake the echo of Oldie Neal's dying words from their minds. "You'll wish you had shared this hanging tree with me," Oldie snarled, and just seconds before the rope round his neck tightened. "You'll all die screaming." Back in town, the murderers immediately made their way to the saloon. For a while they drank in silence, intent on calming their nerves and washing away their guilt. Abe Murfin was the first of the guilty to find his voice. "My God, what have we done?" was all he could mutter. Abe was also the first of the fatally misguided self-appointed lawmen to die. Abe had been dead for several hours and several days by the time his wife found his decomposing, half-eaten corpse in a trough of pig slop on the widow Neal's property. His killer was never found. Wes Smithley had been the next man to speak on that spring night in the saloon. He turned to Samuel Tate and declared, "You made us hang an innocent man." Wes, who had worked all his adult life in a sawmill, was crushed to death a few days later when a skid of logs broke away. The owner of the mill was mystified. All of his equipment was in excellent shape. If any of his employees knew their way around a load of logs, it was Wes. No one ever determined what caused the fatal accident. Wes Smithley was barely in the ground when another of the vigilantes met his maker. Nate Collier was behind the 6-horse team plowing one of his fields. His wife Mary was beside him at the time. She later reported that the horses suddenly reared up, toppled the disc of plow on top of Nate. The trunk of his body was sliced through. The former vigilante bled to death within minutes. For years afterward, Mary Collier puzzled over the incident. She told anyone who would listen, "I can't imagine what spooked those horses so. It was like they had seen a ghost." By now, the survivors responsible for old Neil's murder were on guard. They realized that the young man's spirit would not rest until it had taken revenge on all of them. For this reason, Bert Northrup worked cautiously around his farm. He waited for a day when not even the slightest breeze blew before he climbed up the 60-foot tower to oil his windmill. He had no sooner reached the top when a single strong gust of wind came whipping out of nowhere, sending Bert's body plummeting toward the hard, unyielding ground below. The undertaker reported that every bone in Bert's body had been broken in the fall, and he added that the way the neck had been snapped, just like he'd been hanged. The 3 remaining members of the group that had stolen Oldie Neil's life were by now running scared. One of those 3, Fritz Tharp, had read a piece in the local newspaper about Bert Northrup's fatal accident. That night, Fritz fell into a fitful slumber. In the middle of the night, he woke up in a cold sweat, having dreamed about his own death. Badly shaken, he jumped from his bed and stumbled across the room toward his jug of whiskey. In the darkened cabin, the frightened man stumbled over his kerosene heater. The shack, which old Fritz called home for many years, was instantly engulfed in flames. When his charred remains were found, it was said that the bones of his fingers were gripped across his throat as though he had been choked. By now, almost all the men who had a hand on Oldie Neil's unjust demise were dead. Only the Gentry twins, Tim and Fred, remained alive. Terrified by the thought of waiting for Neil's ghost to take him, Tim Gentry put a gun to his own head. But even his end was not swift, as he was so nervous that his hand shook and he botched his own suicide. It took him several long, agonizing hours to die. A witness was later quoted as saying he died a dog death. Fred Gentry was nearly crazy with anguish. He was the last of the cursed men left alive. He turned himself over to the local sheriff, explaining that in nearly incomprehensible language that he had been cursed and was being pursued by a ghost. Understandably, the sheriff committed the raving man to a lunatic asylum, where he died after weeks of screaming that he was being licked by the fires of hell. In 1903, a reporter from a Washington newspaper heard the blood-curdling ghost story and decided to investigate it for himself. His first order of business was to ride out to the tree where Oldie Neil had been hanged. When he couldn't spot the tree, he questioned some locals and discovered the tree had been blasted into splinters when it was struck by lightning. Even worse, the townsfolk told the reporter the lightning had strike had also taken a man's life. Sam Tate, unconscious from drink, had been lying at the base of the tree when the lightning bolt hit. The ghost of Oldie Neil had extracted his revenge and made good his dying curse. Then in our second and final story in this episode, Wild Ghost Chase. Ghost stories are by their nature baffling. Some contain particular enigmatic elements that make those stories more mysterious than others. The following tale certainly falls within the more mysterious category. It concerns the manifestation of a person who is about to die rather than one who is already deceased. As if it weren't enough to set this ghost story apart, it is also a geographically diverse narrative that begins in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. The year was 1937. A young shoemaker named Emmanuel White was about to wed his beloved, Alice. Emmanuel was very much looking forward to being married. Not only did he love Alice with all his heart, but because his own father had been killed along with many other men in an industrial accident when Emmanuel was just a child, he longed to create a secure home of his own. He was even hoping to become a father one day. The Whites had not been married very long when, in the middle of the night, the husband woke up screaming, initially incoherent from the terror he felt. Emmanuel concentrated on returning his breathing to a normal rate so that he could tell his concerned wife about the terrible nightmare he just suffered. Trying to appear calmer than he felt, Emmanuel began by telling Alice that the dream had been about his father. "But your father's dead, my love," Alice said, trying her best to soothe her badly shaken husband. "But Alice, we don't know that for sure," he cautioned. There were so many bodies found on that day that no one was able to accurately identify the remains of the rubble. "I've always wondered if my father might not have lived through that dreadful accident and used it as an excuse to leave my mother and me." Now this dream seems to be confirming my suspicions. Several hours later, Emmanuel's mind finally settled sufficiently to allow him to go back to sleep. The next morning, however, he was still terribly troubled by that vision that he had experienced. At breakfast, he described his nightmare to Alice. "My father was at a lumber mill," Emmanuel explained. "He was dying and calling for me. I know it was just a dream, Alice, but it seemed so real." "It might have seemed real, but it was only a dream," Alice counseled. "You have to try to set aside and concentrate on the life you're living, not on these terrible visions of your father." Emmanuel knew his wife was right and tried to put the awful images out of his mind, and to a large degree he was successful, until a few days later, when he had the vivid nightmare for a second time. He woke up in a cold sweat and was again unable to get back to sleep. Over the next few years, Emmanuel White suffered with that reoccurring dream many, many times. Each time the vision of his dying father filled his sleep, the images became more and more real. Then it happened. When he was working, grinding the heel of a shoe, when the dreadful scenes that had been haunting his slumber played out before his mind, unable to bear the tension any longer, he turned off all his equipment, locked the door to his shop, and headed for home. Alice was surprised to see her husband home in the middle of the day, and she was even more surprised by his evidently agitated state of mind. "Get some things packed," he barked. "We have somewhere to go." Frightened by her husband's unfamiliar abruptness, Alice silently obeyed. Less than an hour later, they were in the car and heading west of Winnipeg. It was not until they were clear of the city that Alice sensed Emmanuel was finally relaxed enough for her to ask where they were headed. "West, I have to go west," he told her. "My father's working at a logging camp somewhere on the west coast. That I'm sure of." 3 days later, the young couple arrived in Seattle. Emmanuel pulled in beside a telephone booth and immediately began scanning the yellow pages. He searched the listings for lumber outlets and began working his way down the page, phoning each company. With every call, he introduced himself and asked if a man named Douglas White worked there. The young man's supply of dimes was running dangerously low when a lumber company receptionist finally assured him that yes, a Douglas White worked for her company. Emmanuel jumped back into the car. "I've found him, Alice," Emmanuel exclaimed excitedly. "I've found my father." He steered back out onto the road. 45 minutes later, the couple reached the address he had copied from the phone book. Unable to contain his excitement any longer, Emmanuel switched off the ignition, threw the driver's side door open, stepped out of the car, and turned to look at a sight that took his breath away. There, before his eyes, stood the building from his reoccurring nightmare. He would have known it anywhere. In his state of shock, Emmanuel didn't take notice of any details apart from the building itself. He didn't notice the ambulance parked at the curb or the workers scurrying around. To Alice, the activity clearly indicated an accident had just taken place. At the mill, with sudden clarity, Alice finally understood the reason Emmanuel felt compelled to come all this way. Those dreams had been messages from Douglas White, the father who had so long ago deserted his familial responsibilities. His soul had somehow sensed that the end was near and had called out for the son he had missed so much. Emmanuel White, inspired by a nightmare, had driven thousands of miles only to arrive at his father's side just as the older man lay dying on the stretcher. The accident that killed Douglas White had been a freak one. A saw blade cutting its way through some timber had inexplicably shattered, flinging deadly shards of razor-sharp metal at Emmanuel's father with great force. This happened just moments after Emmanuel's phone call. No one except Douglas White had been injured even slightly. Douglas White's doomed spirit had somehow reached out to his only living relative to create a truly bizarre ghost story. Very, very interesting. For our next to last episode of Ghost Stories of Washington. Hopefully you're enjoying this series. Next week will be the finale for Ghost Stories of Washington. So until the next episode, hopefully you enjoyed these thus far, and we will see you soon. Have a wonderful and blessed day. Bye for now.